Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
I know we just recently had a conversation on the podcast and on video about The Sound of Freedom, this new film starring Jim Caviezel that has really taken the world by storm. It's making so much money, and it's part of the national conversation right now. But I just sort of feel like skipped over the surface, and this thing is not going away. And I feel like we must come back and take a deeper dive. We have to talk more about the players, the influences, the agendas. Child sex trafficking is a legitimate horror in this world, but it's also been exploited by bad agents to stoke fear, spread disinformation, and sometimes even fill pockets. And for daring to talk about this stuff, I've had people in my inbox saying, F you pedophile, hey, you pedo, that type of thing. My two guests today know exactly what this feels like. I have Lynn Packer, a former television news correspondent and journalism professor, media consultant, author, and continuing investigative reporter. Also, Damion Moore, an investigative journalist who has a degree in criminal justice, specifically focusing on juvenile delinquency. He's working on an upcoming series called Collateral Damage, the Anti-Human Trafficking Industrial Complex. Both men host the site and the show, American Crime Journal. I'll start with you, Damion. What does American Crime Journal do?
It was founded in 2018 by myself. It was to focus on a lot of things in the true crime industry has gotten a little bit too sensationalized, misreporting. They bring in psychics, body language experts, but we wanted to get more grounded into real cases and cover cases of like missing children that are more obscure, cases that people don't talk about. It wasn't more of like the sensationalized serial killer stuff. And then I came across Operation Underground Railroad when they actually stepped into one of the cases I was covering, the disappearance of Carly Gousset. A gentleman by the name of John Lyons got involved, and he drew the attention of several police officers and a county official and how he kind of spoke to them, and he wanted them to sign a contract to let him know that OUR would be a partner if Carly was found. And when they wouldn't do it, he kind of jumped away. Well, I wrote a comment just by chance on Facebook that says, looking into Operation Underground Railroad, this looks like a club for middle-aged white men to live their James Bond fantasies. And within a week, I get a cease and desist, me and one of my other colleagues, and saying that they would plan to sue us from Curtin McConkie, which is one of the most powerful law firms in Utah, funded by the LDS Church, if I'm not mistaken. So that drew my attention. And then from there on, I started really looking into why would they be so upset just by a random comment. And that's when I came across Lynn Packer's work, and he had kind of retired. Lynn could probably tell you more of the story, but he was done with it. I said, Lynn, I found a bunch of your reports. There was like 40 pages. And I asked him about it, and me and him talked a couple times, and he says, well, I'm going to do one report, and, you can go off of that or other journalists. And then I think Lynn got sucked back into it just like I got sucked into this.
Oh, Lynn Packer, you never really retire. You're always going to be a pain in the ass, aren't you?
Yep.
So what kind of journalism did you do? I mean, I know it's a wide question, a broad question, but what's your history?
Well, I was a television news reporter for 15 years, and I covered beats like the state capitol, city county building for 2 years. I was on a documentary unit and did investigative reporting. And over time, I developed sort of a specialty of covering white-collar fraud. And because I covered government, I began freelancing some stories for a website about corruption in the Attorney General's office. And then the current Utah Attorney General, Sean Reyes, was appointed Attorney General in December of 2013, which corresponds to the time that OUR was formed. And immediately, Reyes and Tim Ballard sort of connect. Reyes was on the mission that's depicted in The Sound of Freedom. So I began covering Operation Underground Railroad from the perspective of Sean Reyes at the very beginning.
So I know there's been some, I was at an expose, but Tim Ballard is a Mormon, right? And for those who were joining us late here, Tim Ballard is what I call him the founder of Operation Underground Railroad. And it is his character on which the film, the Jim Caviezel film, is based. He is a Mormon, is that right?
Right.
And does the Mormon church itself play into this, or is it just that he happens to be a Mormon?
Well, he's a sort of a Mormon in spades because he claims to essentially have had revelation or spiritual confirmation that he should quit his job with Homeland Security and found Operation Underground Railroad. And during this time, he developed a friendship with the Mormon apostle Russell Ballard. There's no relation, they're both Ballards, who took an interest in what he was doing in this movement to rescue child sex slaves. And near the very beginning, it's alleged or suspected that Russell Ballard, the Mormon apostle, invested in Ballard's movie-making ventures. In the meantime, again, allegedly, 2 other Mormon apostles invest as well, probably upwards of $600,000. And then, since then, Russell Ballard has become president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles. That means he's head of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, and he's second in line to become president of the church. He's said to have given Tim Ballard spiritual blessings. That's where someone will lay hands on someone's head and bless them to achieve something. And apparently, Tim Ballard got this blessing to be successful in this mission of rescuing kidnapped child sex slaves around the world.
I'll let either one of you, I guess I'll start with Damion. What do we get wrong about the legitimate horror? What is the public not understanding about this very real thing?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that kidnapping is the major component of this. As well as stranger danger. Over the last 40 years, they merged together. That's why you see a lot of right-wing evangelical individuals that are involved in this. But the public at large really thinks kidnapping is a major component of it, when 95 to 97% is almost always family involvement. It's usually a significant other, friend of the family that is actually trafficking these kids. Almost all the time drugs is involved. And we also kind of changed the term of, people hate when I say this, but in 2000, under the Trafficking and Violence Protections Act, signed by Clinton, we changed the definition of teen prostitution to trafficking, which means if there's money exchanged between, even if it's consenting under law, say for a 17-year-old to get paid for sex, it is automatically human trafficking under those laws. So it's kind of inflated. That's why we've seen human trafficking over the last 20 years or so explode. But it's not like more kids are getting kidnapped or sold. It's almost rare, if as it's ever even happened.
Well, I mean, certainly there have been kidnappings to sell children into something, right?
Well, give us an example.
Well, I'm asking you. You guys
I'm asking you.
I do not know. I don't know.
You said certainly, and what I'll say is there's not a single documented case of it ever happening.
That's interesting.
Kidnapped children. I mean, if you kidnapped a child, it's going to bring a lot of heat on you. You're going to have the FBI involved almost automatically. I mean, would you really want to sell a child to the public and have potential snitches? And
well, let me jump in here, and maybe what I'm thinking, and I'm not trying to defend myself, but I want to be clear. I'm thinking like in a world of 8 billion people, there must be, and so I would think statistically, the laws of probability say that somewhere there is someone who has taken another person, a stranger who is under 17 and actually sold them, prostituted them, whatever, on a kind of black market. That seems intuitive to me. But I take your larger point that the vast majority of trafficking has to do with some sort of a tie, a familial tie.
Yes. But the point I'll just make, like you said, it's possible it could have happened maybe in a third world country. That's certainly not a documented case here in the United States. If it has happened in third world countries, we have seen it with like labor markets and child conscription when they're forced into militaries and rebel armies like in Sierra Leone and all those other countries. But you just don't see it enough where I say the evidence is where it needs to be, the framing, the conversation needs to be around kidnapping. You just don't see it. There's no documented case I can think of, and I've looked into this high and low. I've talked to FBI, I've talked to police officers. I had a cop, head of the Michigan State Police, got mad at me and said, "There's no kidnapping rings, dude. What are you looking for?" And I'm like, "I'm just asking you if you've had a case."
I just learned something about Lynn. He's not going to let me slide on anything. Like if I say something, he's going to be like, "I want peer review, damn it. I want documentation." And I love that about you already. Can we talk about the myth making of this? You mentioned the white savior narrative. I think already there are people hammering onto a keyboard, "How dare you defend the traffickers, you pedophile," which I think is a conversation stopper, right? It's almost like whenever you come out against QAnon, and you say all of this babble about the satanic cabal climbing over the hill to steal your children and kill God or whatever, you're in league with Lucifer. I mean, that's a conversation stopper.
Well,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll say to that is I dedicated many years of my life helping women and children in domestic violence situations as an advocate. And in some of those cases, they were trafficked by their fathers or boyfriends or husbands or whomever. So I find it absolutely disgusting that they would actually even refer to that, because it's something that I'm adamantly against. And I don't know anyone I have not met one person, and I know they say liberals love child molestation and all this, and I've not met one person in my life that has said, "Hey, man, let's go molest some kids," or "Hey, let's go kidnap a kid." I've met people that said, "Let's rob a bank," but I've never seen them steal some kids. I mean, it's never happened to me. I don't know who they're hanging out with.
We're the mustache twirling villains. I hear this when they distort the reproductive rights debate. When they're like, it's not just we believe a woman's right to choose. You know, a woman's right is really inviolable. They hear liberals want to kill babies, and that's the narrative they spin. Lynn, let's talk about Sound of Freedom. Where to start? I'll just let you start. What are we talking about?
Well, a year ago, I broke the story that the main storyline in Sound of Freedom, that's where a bad guy kidnaps a little boy in, I believe it's Honduras, is taking him up through Mexico, gets stopped at the border, is caught by Tim Ballard, according to the movie. He then says, "My sister was also kidnapped," and that begins, Ballard quits his job with Homeland Security because there's not a United States nexus to it, and then wins his way through the story about the sex parties in Colombia, gets more information, and then goes into the jungle of Colombia to rescue the kidnapped girl and kill the perpetrator, the Mexican drug lord. A year ago, I broke the story that none of that is true, not any of it.
And the necklace.
It's all false. Well, yeah, there was a necklace story thrown in. And at the time, it didn't look like the Sound of Freedom would ever hit theaters. And no local media picked up the story. No national media picked up the story. In fact, even now, as you have dozens of reviewers and some reporters doing the story, they're using terms like exaggerated and a little bit too much literary license and embellished. None of that is accurate. They need to do their homework like I did. The same records that I accessed are available to them, and they'll find that nothing is true about that story, even though they're out on they continue to be representatives out on the press tour, pitching the movie, pitching ticket sales.
Well, I
And
find it interesting too, Lynn, that the movie, I think it was produced, 2018, and was floated around to studios who all rejected it, said we don't want any part of this, or they were afraid it was going to lose money, or it was too controversial, or whatever their reasoning was. And it was then released by this Angel Studios, which was mostly noted, I think, for doing these sort of family-friendly versions. They would go and edit out cuss words and naked skin for the Puritan viewers kind of thing, I guess.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to point out, though, is yes, The Sound of Freedom is absolutely false. It's not a true story, any of it, other than there's a man named Tim Ballard. It ends there. But it's important to note, a lot of people say, well, even if it isn't true, there's some literary license taken here, creative liberties. Tim Ballard has told this story, however, for going back to 10 years, beginning on Glenn Beck. They started out as a Pedro story. He rescued Pedro. They even marketed a necklace that people could buy to support this cause. And he had to go rescue this boy's sister from human sex traffickers. And none of that was true. So it wasn't just the movie. Ballard has told this story repeatedly. I even have it on the website of him telling this story to Lewis Howey, to Glenn Beck. He's told it on multiple podcasts. So this is before Sound of Freedom. It's not that the movie took literary license. This was all made up in his head.
So is Tim Ballard, I'll just ask the question. Has he fabricated his own hero myth for fun and profit?
Well, that's been the result, is that he has sought both fame and money. OUR, at the very outset, when it was conceptualized in 2013 through Glenn Beck, was a movie-making, television series-making venture. That was the goal to begin with, that they would get Green Berets, special forces, men to use automatic weapons to go into foreign countries, and they would be the team that went in and rescued the kids. They were equipped with all kinds of cameras to video it all, and then that would be assembled into a television series. So that was the beginning, and of course, Ballard would be the star of the show. No one picked up the television series. So what they did is they cobbled together just hours and hours of video that they had and made a docudrama called The Abolitionists. And that came out in 2016. And The Abolitionists has some of the same footage that you see at the end of Sound of Freedom, right at the end when they say, here's what really happened, here's a real rescue. So anyway, The Abolitionists totally bombed at the box office. Didn't do well at all. It premiered in some theaters here in Utah for a couple of days, some in California. There could have been some other places, but it went absolutely nowhere. And near that time is when Ballard hooked up with the Mexican filmmakers, Eduardo Verástegui, and they decided, okay, we're going to do a feature film. That is, this time we're going to have actors. And they went to a cabin near Park City, Utah. And for 3 days, they brainstormed. And it was during these 3 days that they took a false story that Ballard had been telling up until that point for 3 years about the rescue of a boy and his sister. And they made that the central part of the movie. They had to have some action to put this other footage or these other events around. And that's how it came to be the main tagline when they promote the movie, and the movie itself is built around this rescue that never happened. When Ballard told the story originally, it was different. It was similar, but it was different. When he told the story originally, the kidnapper was an American, like with the movie version, but he kidnapped 2 children in the United States. And he takes them across the Mexican border into Mexico, where a drug cartel holds sex parties. And then these kidnapped victims were used as child sex slaves. And in the original story, he does it several times. Somehow he takes them back somewhere in the United States, kidnaps them again, takes them across the border. Could have happened 2 or 3 times. And of course, that doesn't fit a movie. And so it was the story was altered.
Next, we talk about the child trafficking, blood drinking Jewish space laser satellites overhead, evil cabal of Democratic Illuminati, QAnonery. We got to talk about how all this impacts Sound of Freedom, the film. We'll do it next. If you would like the show early and commercial-free, you have my deepest thanks. Please become a patron at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. Continuing now with Damion Moore and Lynn Packer of American Crime Journal, talking about the smash box office hit, Sound of Freedom. Let's talk about QAnon. It's no accident it's Jim Caviezel in the title role. I mean, I make that connection, right? I mean, isn't it true that Tim Ballard once bought into the QAnon Wayfair furniture child trafficking conspiracy, or pitched like, how is a furniture retailer trafficking children? I don't really know. I'll just throw it out there. Caviezel and Ballard.
Well, Tim requested that Jim Caviezel play him because he had saw him. Tim's version is the Count of Monte Cristo. I have it on good authority. It was because he played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ. So there's no mistake that Ballard sees himself as a Jesus-like character, and people know Jim Caviezel for that. But the QAnon Wayfair conspiracy, and you have to remember in the very beginning, OUR really painted itself as a legitimate organization. They really didn't get into the politics. There's got some actual Instagram photos of Instagram where Ballard actually praises Obama, talks about he liked Obama's borders policy, that he was part of the team that secured the border during Barack Obama's presidency. When the Wayfair conspiracy theory went out, Tim Ballard sort of promotes this. He doesn't say it, but when he's asked about it as an expert, he says, well, it's things like this do happen, not really saying that it's not true or true. But, the greater thing is that we're having a discussion around it, I think was the framing. Maybe Lynn can correct me on that, but that was sort of his framing of it when he's kind of getting called out for this, because
kind of a teach the controversy kind of a line then? Okay.
Yeah, it was kind of like let the controversy take off and that. But I've talked to many trafficking survivors, and for those that say that we're just looking for dirt on Tim Ballard, Lynn Packer actually cleared him of a false rape allegation. Coco Berthman, another girl that we learned was fabricating her own, she was trying to become a professional human trafficking victim, if that's the best I can describe it. And we learned it wasn't true. She said her sister was murdered in front of her and all this. Well, she had read a report about our investigation into Ballard. We were the first ones. Lynn covered it, and I published it on the site of the Davis County Criminal Investigation. There was a portion of it where it said that one of the OUR volunteers had been sexually assaulted. It wasn't her, but she actually had been around OUR and kind of traveled in those circles for her time. Well, then she apparently went and said that Ballard had actually sexually assaulted her. That was not true. We cleared him of that. So if we really just wanted to run with anything, anyone throwing at Tim Ballard, we could have ran with that story. Lynn made it clear this is not true. That did not happen. It's better, and just the way that Detroit head of human trafficking, I've been talking to him for some time about getting some stories out, and Detroit Metropolitan Police Department head of human trafficking says to me, it's better sometimes to have no information than dis or misinformation, because they've wasted more time chasing vampires and ghosts, because things like, their neighbor might be getting a bunch of packages from UPS. He's gotten calls where the neighbors think it's organs, or someone's doing organ transplants, from UPS. And it's like, UPS packages coming in. And this is the stuff that our law enforcement is dealing with. And missing persons reports are almost always misreported. So they're already dealing with that. And now you have movies like this where there's these dark cabals. So to even foster misinformation and to put a movie out like this really creates a strain on our law enforcement. It miseducates the public. And now there's a whole diversion. People are looking for black and brown men snatching their kids, taking them over the border, when it's really the threat to them might be in their own home, at the schools, the neighbors, but they're looking for these mythical things that are now being brandished into ideas of like the border wall. The other day, Tim Ballard said, if we close the border, we would almost cut human trafficking to be non-existent. No, it wouldn't. We would still have the same number of trafficking victims. It would do nothing. So these myths do nothing to help anyone. And now a lot of survivors, and they'll tell you that other people don't want to hear their stories because their story doesn't have gunfights and Mexican cartels and drugs and having to go through the jungle and rescue them. It's all lies. It's no one wants to hear that their dad was pimping her out at 12 years old for crack. That's even a more disturbing story than being kidnapped, but to be betrayed by your own family member. But we're not even talking about that. We're talking about drug cartels and all this nonsense. And it's just simply not true.
Talking here with Damion Moore and Lynn Packer of American Crime Journal. I want to go back to something that I found interesting when you were talking about, I'll call them professional victims, which is another taboo subject. Like, if they say it happened, it must have happened. But I'm also reminded after 9/11, we had people who were fake survivors and they traded on that story for notoriety, even speaking fees, etc. There's kind of I guess it would be almost a Munchausen syndrome. I mean, the idea of a fake victim it's real, right? We're not making that up.
And this comes on the cusp of the Me Too movement. So Lynn and I are getting blowback on both sides. We're getting liberals and stuff saying that I've had people say to me, even if she did lie, by exposing her, you're diminishing possible other survivors. And I'm like, listen, I talked to many survivors, and you can ask Lynn. I think it took him a couple days to even really post that story. I didn't want to publish it at first. But these fake stories are a diversion to the truth. It's minimizing real survivors, and it's a distraction. It does more to danger real victims because we're looking for things that don't exist. And with the Coco Berthman story, what really kind of switched the public's perception is that she goes on to stage a cancer scam that I think she just tried to get expunged yesterday. But she went on to claim that she had stage 3 or 4 cancer. She got like $10,000 from GoFundMe's. Everyone got around her. We got backlash again because how dare we attack a trafficking victim that had, cancer. Now she's dying. And now come to find out that was all a lie. The cancer was a lie. And it was just, and she said her sister was murdered in front of her. And I think Lynn interviewed the sister. I mean, it's like she's alive, resurrection.
So, I mean, if I can jump in again, like I'm all about Me Too. I think it's a necessary thing to have these stories heard. And I have gotten as well. It's hard because the truth matters. If it happened, we need to know that. If it did not happen, I don't think we're cheating the Me Too movement by saying there's a bad agent, because I think the bad agents are cheating the movement.
Yep.
And I've seen a little bit of that. I can't stand Donald Trump. Okay. I can't stand that. He represents the worst of humanity. But I saw somebody post a quote from him that was one of the worst things in the universe. And I, rather than knee jerk into sharing the meme, actually looked it up. And the quote had been debunked. He never said it. It made him look bad, and I wanted it to be true. It didn't mean I love Trump. I still can't stand the guy, but it's not true. And whenever I raised awareness and said, actually, be careful with this one, because this statement was never made by Donald Trump.
Well, Seth, and
people came in and said, why would you ever come to his defense? It's something he would have said.
It diminishes, though, the stuff he has said.
Yeah. I agree.
It diminishes everything else. And it also damages the credibility, because the more you hear about these fake stories or people keep fake quoting him, nobody's going to believe it when there is something real there or something dangerous. And that's a lot of what's happened, is we've become desensitized to these things, and it's done significant damage. There's ample stories to be told. There's victims that want their stories to be told, but it doesn't comport to Lifetime movie networks, cheerleader kidnapped, stalker cheerleader murdered her mom, and all these weird storylines. And it's just not reality. We need to talk about real cases to educate the public. It's kind of like how the DARE program was in the 90s. Reason why it didn't work is because they're sitting there trying to say, oh, marijuana, you'll kill your parents if you smoke it. And it's like, well, I know people that smoke weed. They're not killing their parents. It's just
I heard a line by comedian Kathleen Madigan where people were screaming about how weed was going to be a gateway drug. And she's like, yeah, right. So when a 5-year-old goes into a convenience store and steals a candy bar, the 5-year-old's next thought is, you know what? I'm going to kill a drifter. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Lynn, can we talk more about Ballard? You're the investigative reporter. I mean, has he been involved in illegal or alleged illegalities? I'm not sure where to take that. You tell me.
It may be in my last report that came out just before the movie, I talked about the possibility that the Sound of Freedom's success was really going to backfire and bring a lot of press scrutiny. And that's starting to come true because Vice News, 2 of their reporters, had been covering OUR and the criminal investigation. And then because of financial problems with Vice, they had sort of cut back. And then with the movie coming out, they've re-engaged and they've done the best job of any of the national reporters who have been covering the issue. And they're now being flooded with leads. I don't want to mention what they are here.
No, sure.
But there's a lot of tips that are coming in about Ballard's conduct. And I've gotten some of them too. And some seem like they could be credible.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get you on the record for slander.
Right.
I know a lot of this. We're still in the accusation phase on a lot of this, but I mean, it's a track record. I didn't know anything about Ballard at all till the film released, and I started peeling back the layers of the onion. He's been problematic for a while.
What we have reported, there has been a few allegations that we've gotten, some vetted, some not, but there has been accusations of torture. There's a gentleman named Carlos Bristol who was implicated during when Tim got a psychic lead to get Marty Gardy, who is one of Tim Ballard's most, I would say, his prime case. This is the case that made OUR that he always talks about as Marty Gardy. He's running all over Haiti. He's got a psychic named, I think, Janet Russin, and a guy named Carlos Bristol. He may have been tortured during this time because he was implicated in the kidnap. And I want to be clear, and I think Lynn could probably talk more on this if we do get to that, is we don't even know if he was really kidnapped. We don't know if that's true or not. And this is right around the time of the Haiti earthquake back in 2010. So we got that. One of the allegations people are on record for is that one of the operatives sexually assaulted one of the girls during the filming of The Abolitionist. Tim Ballard went crazy about this. The operative in question did say she wasn't a child, though. He's like, oh, she wasn't under 18. And he had to, because if he didn't, the bad actors, the traffickers would have thought he was a cop, so he had to do it. You ask any CIA operative, and I'm like, no, you can't just do cocaine when you're at a cop's trying to buy drugs. That'll blow the case,
Okay, let me make sure I'm clear.
Mm-hmm.
The story is he was undercover, and they were going to sexually assault the victim. He was sort of up, and if he had not proceeded with sexual assault on his own, he would have been blown.
Well,
right?
It wasn't quite like that. What it was is what they do is one or more OUR operatives act like they're child sex tourists, pedophiles going to another country. This is common around the world where they have sex. So they have less chance of getting caught if they're doing it in their home country. And so they will go in, and usually what they do is organize their own sex party, where they will make contact with the pimps and madams and say, we want to have a party. We've got a lot of money. We want girls and we want young girls. And so at some point before they signal the police to come in and make an arrest, after they've paid the money and you have proof that there's been an exchange of money, and after the girls are brought in, so you have the purported victims, then the police come in. So sometimes the operatives will sit next to the underage prostitutes and sometimes just regular prostitutes, even in a country where prostitution is legal. And at one time, one of the OUR operatives reached over and sort of put his hand down one of the underage girl's shirt. That counts as sexual assault legally, but it's not where they went ahead and had sex or something to make sure that their cover was not blown.
And what I think is important with that, too, is that this is the job they're doing. And Ballard covers it up. There's two producers involved. This is during the filming of Abolitionists, and he had them sign NDAs, so it became a legal battle, actually. Why would you lie about stuff like this? Why would you not report things like this? You're out here calling us pedophiles and insinuating that. I've not sexually assaulted a child. I have not went around demanding children to come over so I can bust pedophiles, creating a false demand for them. But the point is that you're supposed to be upfront and honest. You're supposed to really have a clear picture and transparency when you're dealing with something like this. And every time something comes up, they cover it up, they lie about it, they deny it, then they try to harass that individual into staying silent. I mean, this is a major thing. It's a major problem. Just that one incident we talked about, that's serious. But to sit there and say that better not be in the film and threaten people, it's crazy.
If I may, I want to jump into the money real fast. I know that many of the nation's major anti-child sex trafficking organizations say that they don't either work with OUR or they know about them, but their relationship is casual. I find it interesting that they're not necessarily aligned with the major players in the child advocacy game, but they are receiving donations as if they are. Did I get that right?
Well, OUR does donate to other organizations and sometimes partners with them. What surprised me is that some of these other organizations that claim they are legitimate, why they haven't called OUR out. And maybe it's because OUR brings them so much publicity. Ballard is a master storyteller and fundraiser. Well, I estimate that in the 9.5, going on 10 years that OUR's existed, that it's brought in more than $100 million. And of course, he has all these national platforms being interviewed. He was on one of President Trump's councils that got a lot of publicity. And he's also one that goes around with all these millions and millions facts that purported facts that they use to basically to fearmonger, to make it look like it's more likely that your child could be taken or kidnapped.
And but I mean, if I may, Lynn Packer, that's a rather insidious implication that legitimate child advocacy organizations wouldn't call out a bad agent in the name of self-interest.
I could say
what I'm hearing?
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
I can give you a perfect example of a story that they were so afraid they won't even let me name them or state the exact location. But this is exactly what happened, and they produced the records. I have text messages of Ballard. He was working with a filmmaker named Joe Berlinger, and if you know who Joe Berlinger is, he did the original West Memphis 3 documentary, Paradise Lost, the murder at Robin Hood Hills. Ballard had sent out 2 OUR operatives, or whatever you want to call them, to an African country, and they were there. And they went to what was to be this organization that actually takes in like orphans. They take in orphans, they help them, they go into local communities, children that are like maybe getting into crime, things like that. They housed them. They had room for 74 children. These people from OUR show up. They said, hey, we're looking to see if we can donate to some organization. We're seeing, how legitimate you are, how your operations are, how we can help. OUR goes with them into the local city there. They're handing out OUR blankets, things like that. Months later, they don't hear from OUR. Months later, there is a actual little snippet on OUR's website where they say they had rescued children. And they used the pictures that they were from those 2 people at that actual orphanage that was not funded by nonprofits. They contacted OUR saying, why are you saying you rescued kids? We didn't rescue any kids. There's no sex trafficked kids here. And Tim Ballard literally says to them, listen, we can destroy you. Do you imagine what's going to happen if we go public, and I'm working with Joe Berlinger, who's one of the biggest documentary filmmakers, if we go public and we say that you're not a legitimate organization? And here's the thing. OUR has that type of pull. People believe them. These smaller players that are barely getting by, surviving by some of their own volunteers' credit cards when they're short on budgets, they're not going to say anything about OUR. And some of the bigger organizations like Polaris, they were engaged in some of the very behavior OER is doing by making fake claims. When they first came out, they were saying kidnapped children. So for them to come out and call out OUR, they kind of got in the business the same way. It's disgusting in my opinion, but no one wants to say anything because A, the way the public handles it when you even remotely say that something about human trafficking isn't true, and B, if they got the same type of donors or they're mixing, interests, things like that, OUR has that power to say, hey, don't do business with them. And if they're surviving by the skin of their teeth, they're not going to do it. That's why they won't go on record.
Is Sound of Freedom, would you call it a gateway film into QAnon?
Yeah, well, some call it QAnon adjacent. And that means that it is sort of leaning on QAnon or is trying to attract the QAnon faithful.
Because, I mean, if I may, there's no overt QAnon-y, or it's not a word, in the film.
Well, basically, there doesn't need to be, because Operation Underground Railroad is a conspiracy theory all by itself. It's just more sophisticated. By using all of these inflammatory, fear-mongering statements, all of these statistics, many of which are unproven, many which are false, those are meant to inflame, to create fear, to get people to donate. And it's a version of conspiracy theories. And Angel Studios and Tim Ballard have taken great offense to QAnon being brought up. And they try and distance themselves from Jim Caviezel, who, of course, was preaching QAnon as he was trying to sell tickets out on the press tour. And at one point, Ballard says, and he said this in a couple of interviews, he said, well, it's the liberals who have started a lot of this stuff about QAnon. What they do is put stuff out there that's attributed to QAnon that's really radical because it makes QAnon look worse. So if QAnon comes up, it makes us look worse. And the other thing is Tim Ballard pushing the furries conspiracy theory. Have you heard about that?
Well, explain it for the audience.
Okay, the furries is this. This is a fairly recent one that Tim Ballard has embraced.
Hang on, let me move my cat litter box out of the frame here. Okay, now go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, exactly. Exactly. The furries thing is that a lot of the radical right are upset that many schools are trying to accommodate transgender students. Like it's a boy who is identifying or would rather identify as a girl and vice versa. And so it has to do with sort of public relations and information campaigns so other students know what some are going through, the problem of which restroom to go to when they're trying to identify as one sex or another. So the right wing really objects to that. And so somebody started the furries conspiracy theory is that
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, is that not only are schools helping transgender students identify as something else, that there's a lot of students who identify as cats and they disturb other students because they will sometimes meow in class. I'm not making this up. They would meow in class and sort of lick their paws and such. And so the students at school, to accommodate these furries, would put litter boxes in the bathrooms. And in my last report, I've got a video clip where Ballard is giving a speech to a right-wing group, and he brings up the furries and says, I've heard that there are litter boxes in schools here in Utah.
We got to talk more about the insanity of humanity. Short break. I'll be right back with my special guest from AmericanCrimeJournal.com. Hang on. Continuing now with Damion Moore and Lynn Packer, investigative journalist, podcasters, and host of AmericanCrimeJournal.com. I was being philosophical And I was talking like, I don't think our species will die. We're not going to die from the aliens or for some sort of physical virus. I am convinced that we, humankind, will die of stupid. I look around and I just think there is so much irredeemable stupidity, and people buy it and believe it. The furry one is just one example. The whole QAnon thing, hearing Jim Caviezel on these press tour interviews talking about the torturing of children to jack up their adrenaline so we can harvest the adrenochrome to create an eternal youth serum. Mm-hmm. And this guy is starring in $100 million grossing movie. It's crazy.
Well, to go back on that furry thing, Joe Rogan started that. He said a friend of mine's wife actually had the school had to accommodate a student who identified as a cat, and they had to put a litter box in the bathroom. And then he retracts it 2 weeks later, saying that he had got it wrong, only like in passing, you know. But you're right about that, Seth, because if you remember, if you've even seen it, 2 days ago, Joe Rogan takes an MSNBC headline where it literally says, radical right obsession with physical fitness. That's what MSNBC says. And Joe Rogan turns it into, oh, I guess everyone that wants to be physically fit is radically right people, or they're alt-right. That's not what they said, even in the headline. It's basic comprehension. They said the radical right's obsession with physical fitness. And that's exactly what they're doing here with Lynn and mine's reporting. If we say something about Tim Ballard, it's pedophile, pedophile, pedophile. And what's happening is they're doing more damage doing that because it's disregarding the real stories. They're playing into the game. So you're absolutely right. The stupidity is right there, and it's just basic fifth grade comprehension with headlines and twisting. And the question I would ask Joe Rogan is he really that stupid where he didn't understand that headline, or is he being deliberately dishonest? One or the other. It can't be anything else. Maybe both.
I thought I heard Joe Rogan's surveillance aircraft flying over your house there.
That was me. I live right near the runway to Hill Air Force Base, and the fighter jets are taking off day and night.
Taking the highway to the danger zone.
Yeah.
There will probably be a sequel, right? I mean, big money.
Right. It's been announced already. Caviezel has mentioned twice that there's going to be a Sound of Freedom 2. Sean Reyes says there's also going to be a Sound of Freedom 3, but Sound of Freedom 2, Caviezel says, is already written. The scripting was paid for, the screenplay, and he says it's a lot better than Sound of Freedom 1. So you'll have a lot of people anxious and waiting for that to come out. And he said that one will center on Haiti. And Damion referred to one of the rescues in Haiti involving a little boy who disappeared. Now, that one, if they ever do that, and I sort of doubt it will ever come to it, is going to raise far more questions than this movie that centers on Colombia. Because in Haiti, there are a lot more allegations about what OUR may have done. There are allegations that seem rather credible that they were bribing judges and police officers in order to facilitate these raids on brothels. They didn't do as many sex parties in Haiti. They usually would do raids on brothels. They did do some sex parties, but that's really going to open up another can of worms.
The three words that I just want to punctuate, I want to make it the title of the show. I want to tattoo it to everybody's forehead. The question that we have to ask is it true? I don't think this is a betrayal of the children, right? It's not a betrayal of the necessary, worthy advocacy and protections of children. But we have to ask, is it true? And I'll end with this question, and I'll let either or both of you answer. Where would you direct somebody who genuinely did want to help support the agents, good faith agents that are advocating and rescuing children? Is there a specific direction that you would send them?
Well, when you say rescuing children, that still implies that somebody is going to go into
Well, not
going to
necessarily. I mean, if someone's kidnapped or trafficked by a stepfather or something, I mean, you would still be an agent of rescue. That's the context.
Well, then it really, the word trafficking has become more than meaningless. And they need to go back to when I was a reporter, and trafficking was never associated with people. It was associated with drugs. They should be a lot more precise, just as you hinted at. That's exactly what it is. And if someone is grooming, they're not trafficking. Trafficking implies that at the very least, money is involved in some ways. And it is true that some parents around the world will allow their children to engage in sex for money because they're in poverty. It's one way of making money. And so they should be really clear about exactly what trafficking means. I just wanted to make one other point that ties into that, is that Tim Ballard won't do interviews with just straight journalists and reporters. They've turned Damion and I and others down many times. And the question that I would like to ask Tim Ballard is, name one child out of the tens of thousands that you've said you've rescued who was kidnapped into sex slavery, that is, into some form of prostitution, either sold to someone who was running a brothel or whether they themselves would sell their services to pedophiles. Name one. If there's all these millions, they talk about the 2 million children who are in sex slavery, there has to be some, like you said, maybe somewhere there has to be some. Name one. You're the one combing the world for kids who have been kidnapped and forced into sex slavery. And that was at the very beginning of the mission. And the way you can tell there isn't one is because now they're making a movie. And the most dramatic thing that they could do is to rescue somebody who was kidnapped. And so when they're making the movie, they don't even have one real example to base it on. They have to make the whole thing up. They have to make up a kidnapping and these two kids being forced into sex slavery.
Well, if they start the film with the words based on a true story, it becomes sort of a de facto documentary for a great many people.
Well, exactly.
Well, Seth, let me just say this. You asked where can we direct people's attention if they really want to help? This is the problem. For the last 30, 40 years, the American right has actually diminished and disrespected journalism. They've questioned the credibility of medicine, science, as well as now law enforcement. The very people that can do stuff about this, such as Child Protective Services, Department of Children and Family Services, who handle this, who you would report child sex abuse to, people say they don't trust or it's corrupt. So, I mean, OUR can't do anything about that. If you don't trust the system, you won't report it, or you made it seem questionable, or the FBI are bad guys. Well, OUR can't do anything about rescuing them. That's here in the United States. So even if they are going into third world countries and rescuing kids, how easy would it be for me to pay off and find some kid who's homeless and say, oh, I rescued him from sex trafficking? There's no paperwork. There's no validation. And like Lynn said, the language being used around teen prostitution is what we called it in the 90s. It was the rage of all the talk shows. Now was turned to human trafficking. And I'm not saying that teen prostitution is good, but using the word trafficking implies something nefarious. And when you say human trafficking back in the day, that literally meant taking someone from their agency and moving them somewhere else and selling them as a person, their agency, to someone else. They've used it to describe basic prostitution. He's used trafficking to describe pedophilia. He's using trafficking to describe grooming. He's using trafficking to describe, even child pornography. These are not trafficking words. And when you keep using it, everything else is meaningless. And like I told you earlier, when that law went into place, if they really cared about the victims, when they made that law, the Trafficking Violence Protections Act back in 2000 that Bill Clinton signed, they still arrest these girls for prostitution when they arrest the John for trafficking, and they get her to flip on him. So now they have this trafficking case. And if you look at this case that Sound of Freedom is based on, the lie that Tim Ballard told, the two border agents that actually saved this boy from a pedophile for doing their job at the border Why didn't he tell their story? Why did he steal their agency? Why did he steal the agency? The only thing this girl had left that escaped her traffickers in New York City after 3 years of hell and being prostituted out, why would he steal her agency and say, I rescued her from, pulled her out of a vent and all this nonsense that didn't happen when she rescued herself? The one thing that could have really inspired survivors out there, that could have inspired future victims who might have heard her story and be like, you know what? I could do this myself. No, it's a white man's going to come and rescue me one day. So if you diminish law enforcement, science, you're diminishing journalism. Basically, you've created this sort of niche where people can just make stuff up, claim whatever they want to claim. They don't have to prove it. And if you question them, they shout you down as a pedophile. They shout you down as, wanting to be a pro-drugs. Or you say decriminalization of cocaine, they say you want kids to be shooting heroin in the schools. It's disgusting. And when you really think about what Tim Ballard's done, is absolutely disgusting to claim these stories, steal the valor of agents who did their job, and then turn around and say that we need a border wall. Well, the border worked in that instance. It worked back then. Now you're saying it doesn't work. We need a wall. You weren't even there. You were 45 minutes away. But yet he told this story as a real story for 10 years. And then they based the movie off of that.
And
now
if it's an emotionally charged subject, people who are desperate to be advocates will lean into it without fact-checking. I think the two things I'm trying to take away from this minefield of a conversation are, it matters if it's true. And two, we need to use the right tools for the job, the right language to describe the atrocities that are going on. Am I hearing that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would like to add one thing to your question. What can people do? Because at the end of the movie, they answer that question. What can we do? What should you do? And the answer clearly at the end of the movie is go out and get more people to buy tickets. Now, if I were standing outside the theater and people were coming out of watching The Sound of Freedom, they're crying, they're hugging each other. And if they walk up, what can we do? What can we do? I would tell them, you're already doing something. You're paying taxes. You're supporting the government. Governments, especially in the United States, have all kinds of programs to help children who are being sexually exploited and abused, whether it's through pornography or through actual sexual misconduct. The United Nations is spending millions. Other countries are spending millions of dollars. The FBI is involved. Homeland Security is involved. In the state of Utah, you have ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children. It involves the FBI. The state attorney general's office. Most of local law enforcement is involved. Many local law enforcement agencies and county attorneys have people assigned to handle these cases. They're out there trying to find pedophiles who are making child porn videos and trading them online. Millions and millions of dollars. And Ballard is always diminishing the effectiveness and what government is doing, and it's a disservice. We are already doing something about it.
And to add to that, because what Lynn just said is that, they buy more movie tickets. Well, Tim's rescuing kids overseas. He doesn't have the power to do anything here. So these people have the audacity to act like they're doing something. I mean, last week they were experts in deep sea submersibles. Now they're experts in trafficking. But the issue is that even going to OUR, they're not doing anything here in this country. You are paying your taxes. You are paying for the government. There are programs with NGOs that have done this for years. Former victims that have partnered with these organizations. Elizabeth Smart Foundation, who wouldn't even partner with OUR at the end because of their so-called aftercare program or lack thereof. The issue is they keep acting like, well, you got to have Tim Ballard rescue him, but he's not doing anything here in the United States. It's a government accountability if you think it's not doing enough. If you think in a lot of these red states, if you look at sort of like the child abuse statistic rates, because they keep taking away and lowering their taxes to get elected, a lot of these programs, like after-school lunch programs, where kids would be safer going in earlier for breakfast, an excuse for them to leave the home if they're being neglected, abused, because there's all sorts of child abuses. You have neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse. they defund these things that would help these children because, government corruption, taxes, government mismanagement. So they want to fund an organization that's rescuing people they won't even want in this country. They want to build a wall and block them out. But Tim Ballard is flying them in by helicopter, getting an emergency visa because it makes him look good. Here's Venezuelan prostitutes. He flies in and gets an emergency visa. Imagine if I would have brought 4 Hispanic children over from Mexico. They would be calling me a coyote. I'm bringing in the illegal border security. I'm not respecting the laws. You see what I'm saying? They're utilizing this for their own political agenda, their own money-making ventures. And Lynn is absolutely right. And if you feel that the government's not doing enough, then get involved. There's plenty of organizations that oversee these things, but when you're telling people, all the pedophiles are in DCFS or Child Protective Services, no one calls them, or they end up calling organizations like OUR, of whom I've had victims call me and say, I called OUR, they hung up on me. They said to call the police. Well, if you're directing them to the police anyway, why are you telling people they need to call OUR? It's just, it's a scam is what it comes down to. That's really what this is.
Damion Moore and Lynn Packer. The website is AmericanCrimeJournal.com as we brace ourselves for our email inboxes and the comment sections. in the desperate hope that nuance is not totally dead and that good faith conversations about bad agency can exist even in the most sensitive of contexts, because ultimately it matters if it's true and it cheats legitimate issues if it's not. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
We'll continue to watch and listen, okay?
Thank you, Seth.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.